In Uncharted 4, there is a part where you make your way through the financial district of Libertalia. In search for the treasury building, you try to climb up over a blown-up wall to suddenly discover that the floor has been destroyed, leaving you with no choice but to slide down a muddy ramp. It carries you to the heart of one of its many fancy pirate establishments, a relatively large room full of ancient artifacts, debris and overgrown grass. Still, your next move is immediately obvious. To the right is a giant staircase, only it branches off and thus presents you with a choice. Which side do I go? Intuitively, you choose left, as far away as you can from your original starting point, but unfortunately it leaves you stuck at a dead end. And so, you make your way back, thinking, these bastards, of course it was the less obvious right side all along. And indeed, it quickly appears that you have found your destination. Though the floor has been split up into two platforms, an easily reachable ledge for Drake with a single jump gives off the impression that this must be it. Nevertheless, you're left disappointed once more. On the table lies a collectible treasure, not necessarily a bad reward for your efforts, but if there's anything Uncharted players know, it's that optional treasures are always found off the beaten path. It's a clear sign that you were tricked. The way to progress was in fact never actually here. And so, as you walk back and down the staircase, you're greeted with one last surprise. Right in front of you, there is a massive blown-up door. It had been right there, just a few steps away, but purposefully blocked off by piled-up barrels, carts and crates, so you would have never spotted it before. This is just a small example, but it highlights how cleverly Naughty Dog can use its level design to steer you unconsciously in their desired patterns, to essentially decide the decisions you're going to make. Having watched probably dozens of people play through the game, whether in real life or on Twitch, it's amazing to see how 9 out of 10 times the exact same route is followed, despite never forcing you to explore each corner in this exact order. Since the first Uncharted game in 2007, linear games have had Naughty Dog's full focus, and in that time they've mastered the art of giving away both helpful as well as deceptive visual clues when needed. This is used to enhance the experience in several ways. It can be used as an element of surprise, it can help keep up the preferred pacing, make environments feel much bigger than they may be in reality, and it can allow the games to feature unprecedented cinematic moments without being afraid to leave you as the player in control. Where the amazing characters, well-written dialogue, and astonishing presentation are easy targets of praise by gamers and press alike, it's even easier to overlook the smaller details that don't always get to be talked about. In this video, I want to take a deeper look at that particular art and to highlight how years of iteration allowed them to achieve this over the course of many games. Naughty Dog's games have seen quite the evolution since their inception. Of course, we could talk about the extremely early days of games like Rings of Power and Way of the Warrior. We could talk about the entirely guided 3D levels of Crash Bandicoot or the Grand Theft Auto-esque open worlds of Jak and Daxter. The truth is, looking at the gameplay formula their current franchises in Uncharted and The Last of Us are built upon, you only have to go back as far as 2007 to see the lessons that were learned. Uncharted Drake's Fortune marked Naughty Dog's first venture into the linear, narrative-driven single-player experience, and revisiting it today, quite frankly, it shows. While this game will forever hold a special place in my heart, it is certainly not difficult to acknowledge its missteps either when it comes to level design. In this regard, Drake's Fortune's biggest flaw is not just how little, but how poorly it communicates essential information to new players. Let's take a look at some examples. Very early on, at the beginning of the second chapter, you try to find the hidden entrance to Eldorado's temple, and this leads you to an open area with many massive pillars. Now, the jungle is a dense space, and the similarly colored vegetation won't always make it easy to sense what to do next. As a result, most people I've watched play the game end up walking around desperately, trying to climb up any wall they see. Now, some of you will say that this isn't necessarily a case of flawed design, but that Naughty Dog might have wanted to give gamers a hard time figuring things out. Evidently though, that is untrue. You see, if you get stuck at almost any point for more than just a minute, then the game will eagerly present you with a hint that completely spoils exactly what to do. Naughty Dog always aimed for their games to keep the pace up and therefore the story moving. In practice, what does that mean for this particular scenario? Well, most players spend their time hopelessly exploring for handholds to no avail until, at immediate glance, they'll simply hit the button telling them where to go. Consequentially, every similar scenario that follows in the game always plays out the same. You can see quite a few of these confusing situations in the early chapters of the game, sometimes wanting you to jump on surfaces that would have never been climbable in other circumstances, or even requiring awkward diagonal jumps to other platforms that just seemed like an inorganic choice to say the least. It's funny because I recently saw an episode of Retro Replay where Amy Hennig, Uncharted's creative director, talked about some of the developers' challenges, and she used this exact occasion to acknowledge these mistakes, referring to it as Level Design 101 that they somehow completely dismissed. Furthermore, there are a few shortcuts that can be opened up. They are meant to save time, but once again are visualized so ineffectively that they tend to be completely ignored. I've seen countless of players accidentally drop down at the area from before, but go at it once again from the start, totally unaware of the rock that dropped earlier to shorten up the process, just as I've seen people dumbfounded at the top of Chapter 6's tower because the game utterly failed to highlight the rope that can now be used to get down. Figuring out what to do next in your first playthrough of Drake's Fortune just isn't very fun because it comes down to trial and error. When you don't notice the stone blocks that bring the gate down in the jet ski level, you're simply stuck until the hint eventually pops up. When you come across the chain in Chapter 9's tower, there is no telling whether you have to move it or not, shimmy left or go right, and once you've jumped past a set of exceptionally small platforms, it is just about impossible to revert your choice without jumping to your death first. Is there anything Drake's Fortune did do right in terms of design? Well, truth to be told, very little. I guess I've made that clear by now. Granted, for most people, these are no more than just hurdles in the moment. The game is short, let's not forget the majority of it plays out as a cover-based shooter, but if future games were to step it up in this regard, then it was clear some rethinking these ideas would be much desired. 2 years later, Naughty Dog had finally discovered it. The answer to every problem. All this time it had been within their grasp, but only now did the solution struck the mind of one incredibly genius designer. It was nothing less than the color yellow. No, in all seriousness, the studio had found that by using visual clues, often highlighting an object with a particular color, had the effect of drawing the player's attention towards it, which spared them from many minutes otherwise spent looking where to go next. Street signs, flagpoles, rain pipes, each were marked with colors just slightly oversaturated, simultaneously taking away those moments of doubt, of questioning whether this could really be the way forward. Although managing to pull it off in a much more subtle manner as time has evolved, this technique is one that the company continues to deploy today. We can see repeated visual patterns in Uncharted 4 to indicate that Drake can glue himself to a wall. We can see those distinctive yellow warning signs that totally fit within the quarantine zones of The Last of Us, but are actually just there to tell you that you're heading in the right direction. Interestingly, the latter game managed to expand on this particular system, using overly exposed lighting sources to essentially create the same effect. For example, take the many spotlight lamps that guide you through the hospital maze at the end of the game and eventually lead you to the West Wing, or take the bookstore in Pittsburgh, a large 2-story building where the obscure exit is marked not only by a sign and a lit up barrel, but an enemy covering the doorway. All these little touches are meant to draw your attention, essentially handing out those same D-pad button hints that Drake's Fortune would, without having to blatantly write them out. I do have to hand it to Drake's Fortune for this last one though. Cleverly utilizing enemy spawns is actually the one thing it did do right from the start. Pirates would often come in waves, and those waves could be used to focus your mind on their location. The last wave would bring a grenade launcher guy who'd blow up the blocked entrance, allowing you to leave, or they'd simply line up in a single direction so you wouldn't mistakenly take a turn in a slightly bigger environment. Essentially, something to keep in mind playing Naughty Dog's games is that going whichever direction enemies came out of is always the right move. Now, in The Last of Us, you were finally able to skip many of its fights by silently sneaking past clickers and hunters. Therefore, their starting positions were often used to reveal your ultimate destination. You are then given the option: do I try to make it past unseen or clear out the entire field first? One last gameplay type which all these visual clues specifically made possible now were the chase sequences that started to play a large role in Uncharted 3. All the before mentioned elements culminated in a level where you play as young Drake while escaping on the rooftops from Marlowe's men. Smart constant repositioning of the camera, enemies coming in from certain angles to steer you in different directions, as well as these strikingly red roof panels to guide you along made this level a real blast. It allowed Uncharted to have these spectacular moments, and more importantly, you felt totally in control playing them. Naturally though, after 3 subsequent Uncharted installments, this blueprint became increasingly obvious. Let's just say there's only so many times you can have someone search for the yellow rail before it becomes exactly that, searching for the yellow rail. The risk of making linear games is that they can feel extremely formulaic, having you move from one room to the next and transitioning from one repetitive combat scenario into another familiar climbing section. The Last of Us must have undoubtedly been refreshing in that way, not only from a player's perspective, but for the development team as well, as it forced Naughty Dog to think outside of the box and come up with entirely new ways to keep the experience unpredictable. I already just mentioned the focus on stealth, which generally meant that combat arenas became bigger, enabling you to form your own strategies. A few times, the layout of a broken down building can have you go in circles, figuring out where to go next. The Last of Us also replaced Uncharted's traditional puzzle rooms with more practical environmental challenges. To bridge a gap, you'd go looking for a plank. To help Ellie, who can't swim across the water, you find her a raft. Early on in the game, these tasks are as simple as they sound, but with every next confrontation, your expectations are constantly toyed with somewhat. All of a sudden, a raft might be stuck in the water. Your ladder can break off, forcing you to reconsider your next move. You initially crawl through a pipe with no problems, until the next one turns out to be blocked off, requiring you to go back and fix it. Smaller moments like these are honestly few and far between amidst the dozens of fight sequences, but it's where Naughty Dog learned that being deceptive can be another way to provide a fun break from the action. That brings us back to Uncharted 4 and the example I referred to in the intro. I personally believe that Uncharted 4 shows an exponential leap in how it expands the range of unique scenarios that make not only the story, but the gameplay experience feel so much richer and interesting to discuss. First of all, Uncharted 4's level design is highly impressive when compared to any previous Naughty Dog game. Oftentimes, its environments manage to give a sense of total freedom, even where that isn't entirely the case at all. Now, I know what you're thinking, but I'm not just referring to the few open world chapters it includes, but also to the intricate layouts of some of the linear levels you run through. Take the Italian auction, where you try to stay hidden from guards as you find a way back from the power center to the ballroom. Made up out of so many uneven and asymmetrical buildings, it's really hard to tell how you're supposed to get back. The thing is, players will feel inclined to travel via the most outer edges, as the guard spotlights are bound to catch them otherwise. That's exactly the point, because not doing so would reveal how little choice you'd have in reality. The same counts for Chapter 11's armored truck chase or the open jungle level in Chapter 13. Once again, the number of available alleyways to drive through or the many platforms to jump on may seem infinite, but in the end, they all lead the same way. Your natural inclination is to drive down the hill, and using vertical mudslides which can be walked back up on, Drake will eventually always end up on the same closed-off jungle area that you are meant to head forwards from. When it comes to the actual open world ports, that's where the visual clues come back into play. Although you can for once go off the beaten path and find several treasures or optional enemy hideouts, most players will be unaware of a few inconspicuous elements steering them in the right direction. Two identical pillars consistently mark the correct path ahead, reinforcing them as positive guidelines in your head, whereas every now and then, a very small drop into a new subsection prevents you from ever being able to travel back. Uncharted 4 also upped the ante as far as blending in action moments with scripted set pieces went. Not only were cutscenes no longer pre-rendered and therefore didn't bring along their jarring 2-second screen cuts anymore, it gave the company the ability to be creative in how those transitions take place. During the prison fight, you're initially only confronted with a couple of random inmates. This is done so that only once you've beaten up a select amount of them and the fight has lasted long enough, Gustavo can automatically show up, start brawling with you, so you can throw him into a laundry machine and the scene can finally come to an end. There are many other carefully constructed sequences like these, like how the game always makes sure you'll lose the majority of the motorbike group during the famous convoy chase, leaving you with just a single rider to your left who you are meant to hit, which triggers the next cutscene. However, the deceptiveness of Naughty Dog's level design truly reached new heights in this game, in a way that I find both intriguing and amusing to look at from a distance. One particular trick that is utilized constantly, yet always ends up being so effective, is how you are misled on a certain path, only to find that the answer is right behind you. For example, sneaking through the vents at the auction has your eyes peeled to the left, where you're allowed a few peeks at what is taking place outside. This is intentionally done, so you totally miss and crawl past the entrance on your right and be informed about it by Sam once you're eventually led to a dead end. The same goes for the open jungle vehicle levels, where several side tracks ultimately lead nowhere, but the actual destination remains hidden. Only once you reach the complete backside of the river and turn back perplexed, suddenly you can see it. My favorite case though is in the Dark Mummy Cave of Chapter 19. After several minutes in an infinite tunnel network, you'll eventually reach a room with a path going left and another going right. Now, whichever one you take, Elena meets you in the middle, leaving you totally confused where to go next. Most players find themselves trying either side several times again, only to be left completely baffled when it turns out the entrance was in fact behind them instead. They'll ask themselves, how was that possible? How did I even arrive here then? But it's because you'll have forgotten by this time that this was an area you dropped rather than walked into like usual. To bring over the environmental puzzles of The Last of Us, Uncharted 4 cleverly incorporated the grappling hook and used several repeated crate moments that always added an additional layer of challenge. It starts off simple enough where you move it around and climb your way up, but then becomes an object you can hook onto, drop off of other platforms and carry through the water. In what I hope you'll now recognize as Naughty Dog tradition, at one point you're even fooled by being given a crate that it turns out you're not even supposed to use. Adding all of these additional obstacles makes a lot of sense. Uncharted 4 was intended as a slightly slower paced finale that used all of this extra time exploring its wider environments in company of your longtime friends to get you to spend a few more precious hours with the characters you'd be saying goodbye to for good. The challenge for Naughty Dog in designing its linear levels therefore also gradually became a different one compared to previous entries. Not necessarily to always keep the pacing high, but in fact to enable you to explore every nook and cranny before being forbidden to turn back. Where this is noticeably evident is upon discovering Libertalia with Sam. It's an extremely dense space with several houses, a stable and prison to explore. Every building tells its own little story. It would be a real shame to pass by it all so quickly. And so, to ensure players spent that time appreciating what undoubtedly took a lot of effort from developers to create, the next area is discreetly hidden away behind somewhat of a fog, which you'll be inclined to initially skip by a couple of times without taking any notice. Again, subtle control of the actions you're going to take is of Naughty Dog's utmost desire. Even in Uncharted 4's very epilogue, in what will be the last bits of input you'll provide to the game, chances are you'll be completely unaware of the brilliant little touches behind its design. Not only is Cassie's house modeled so you get to look through it fully before exiting through the door, its final nostalgic moment plays out much more guided than it may seem. When opening up the cabinet to find Drake's collection of artifacts, you get one last opportunity to relive the numerous memories through all your adventures. The astrolabe, Francis Drake's journal, a vial of resin, but only one item will trigger the final cutscene. Cassandra Morgan's journal is meticulously hidden behind a silver skull, that only upon looking at it, Cassie will put back at a different spot, so that the option to grab the last item can at last be unlocked. As a player though, you'll naturally go through all the yet unexplored angles first, ensuring that when you do take out the book, you won't seem forced to leave the cabinet behind without feeling ready to do so. I hope this analysis has helped showcase why I feel it's safe to say Naughty Dog has mastered the craft of controlling your experience with a natural approach unseen anywhere else. It's hard to imagine, but as a fan of dissecting every minute detail going into the work of creating games, I cannot wait to see these techniques even further evolve.